Now what I want to do is have the ability to send a message to change the state. So if I have this going out, let me assign this to the window object experience parser. That way I can send it messages from the console, or I can call methods on it. So it starts with part 1. And now if I were to call state change on part 2, it would create a third desk, I think, because state change just pulls the state by name, it goes through every entity and creates them. But we actually want to create or update, so we'll handle that next. But let's test this in the browser real quick, see what happens. So if I refresh this page, we get that, and window.experience parser change state change. If I say part 2 now, indeed we see a third box. And what we want to happen instead is that any entities that have an existing name, so let's say that the full name need a way to get the full name of an element, of an entity. And that is this thing that we used here. Consider that as the full name. Let me grab this. So we'll call this full name, passing in the entity. This will return this string. And first we're going to check the scene to see if this exists. So let's see, we can do this scene get mesh by name, and the name is, store this full name equals this, let's call this get the full name, get full name with the entity, change this to just full name, and we'll see if this exists by full name. So let the mesh equal this. So if there's a mesh, then we do this, else. We'll do some other stuff. We'll put this inside the scenario where we're doing other stuff. So if there's a mesh, it's already in the scene, we don't need to create it. And let's move it. So if the entity attribute position this, then we'll call mesh position and move it over there if it matches by name. So let's see what this does. So we've got the first part, we go to the second part, and we move one of them. Let's try to move the other one too. So this one, desk 1 and desk 2. We'll move this one to the same position, but maybe a little bit higher. So we have position 1, part 2. We can go back to part 1. and part 2. So these things are changing based on which state you selected. But if we remove it, if we remove an element, that's the final state. Maybe we should delete it. So if there is an element in the scene that isn't in the state, maybe we should hide it or dispose of it. Okay, I'm going to go with removing them. So if I remove this one here, I want one of the boxes to disappear. And the way I'm going to do this is by tagging every mesh that I touch in the create or update entity. So if there's a mesh here, then I'm going to tag it by mesh.add tag. What is it called? Babylon js.tags add tags to the mesh, and the tags string is so now I need to know the state. So we need to give the state, which is a string. And then here, I also need to know the previous state, because I'm going to be deleting all of those that match the previous state. Previous state string. So then here, we're going to create entity, let's let mesh, what is this? Abstract mesh. Let mesh be abstract mesh. So first, let's see if mesh can be assigned if there's a mesh. Then we do that if there isn't a mesh. So cut this and just put this logic at the very end. Mesh is the new state, and we'll call this mesh. Mesh. This becomes mesh. And mesh. Okay. So and then okay, so we need to keep track of the current state. Public state is a string or no, and public previous state is a string or no. So in the beginning, this dot state is null, and this dot previous state is null. And when you set the state, we're going to say change state to this new state name. And we're going to send in this. Well, I guess we don't have to send in anything except the new state name. well, let's center both in. So we'll say previous state is this dot previous state and this dot state name or state. So we're sending that in. So for every element it does that. Okay, we don't need the previous state yet. We didn't use it. Right? Yeah, we didn't use it. So this doesn't need this thing. My mistake. Comes in here, comes in here. It's just marking those things that are mentioned in the specification. But when we're done, then scene.get mesh by tags, and you get the this.previous state, and then for each, well, what is the return result of this? Returns an array of meshes. This let or previous meshes is this. Then just go through them and delete them all, dispose them all. So previous meshes dot for each mesh go and mesh dot dispose. So that should remove them all. Well, this one marks them all with the current one. And then one last thing, we have to say that this previous state equals this dot state, and then this dot state is state name. So now we go over here, can I read properties of null? Whoops. What did I hit? Okay. Refresh. Okay. What line is this happening on? That one tries to eval, get by tags. Okay, get by tags, and there might not be anything right. Yes, okay, so get by tag. Get by tags, its previous state is null or empty string. Right. Previous meshes, which should be an empty array, so I think that should fix it. Okay, it did not draw anything. Okay. Alright, so what's happening here? We're going through, change the state. It goes to here, create or update entity. So if you get meshes by tags and they aren't tagged correctly, you end up deleting them all, right? So let me see if this is the issue. Do that. Okay. I'm going to put the scene. I'm going to put the scene on the window so I can do some debugging. Window scene equal scene. And I'll say that scene dot get mesh by tag meshes by tags, and I have to do that. It gives back everything. Really? Oh, because right, everything has an empty tag, so you just grabbed everything. If I grab the first one, tags, what are the tags? TTT. Anyway, so that's why we deleted all of them. So the parser, if this previous state existed, so it's not null, then attempt to do this. Okay, I'll clear this and switch to part 2. Okay, it moved one of them, but we should remove the other one. So what happened there? Right, because we added them, but the previous state hasn't been changed yet. Because at this point, previous state is still null, so there's nothing to delete. So this is fine. What if we put this behind the other statement? So we say that the previous state, we're going to lose that variable. So we got state name coming in, state name coming in, and previous state. Yeah, I think it's safe to put this up top actually. I would probably put this at top. So the previous state was a state. The new state is a state name. And we'll, okay, go for the state name, go for all these things, and you're going to update them to the new state name, and then the previous state, you're going to go and I think that should fix it. Like this, go to state 2, they both are deleted. Oh yes, we need to remove this part. This previous state. That shouldn't have gone down this path though, if there's a previous state. Okay, console.log, the previous state is, let's say this previous state. Do this, the previous state is part 1. Okay, find me all the previous message. Console log, the previous meshes are, let's say previous meshes. There should only be 1, I believe. But we got back 2. The previous meshes are that. Why? Part 1. So let's just let's comment this out. Do that. We have part 1. Go to part 2. Now find me all the things that have part 1. What about part 2? Oh, you added the tag. Oh, it's a list. It's not replacing it. So you have to remove. Right. Righto. You have to remove the state. And that is why we need the old state, so we can remove that tag. So I don't think we need to pass this in. Since we now have them as state variables, we can just do, and changing the state, this is the new state. Okay, so we can just say this can be this.state and whether on tags equals remove tags from this mesh and this dot previous state. Cannot read properties of null. Okay. If this dot previous state is something. Now switch to part 2. No change at all. Part 1. Oh, need to put this code back in. And yes, there's a bug here. Okay, switch to part 2. Okay, nothing happened. What happened here? So we're parsing the create or update entity. It goes through here. Console. Okay, so we're going to part 2. Nothing is logged here. Why is that? So we go to part 2, change state. Let's put this experience. Do we put the experience on the window object? Yeah, experience parser. Okay, so we just loaded this. What is experience parser? What is in here? So we have parser previous state is null, and the state is part 1. Great. And we want to switch to change the state to part 2 now. Oh, it worked. Experience parser now is previous state is part 1, new state is part 2. There's only one. And we can switch back to part. Okay, going to part 2, no change. Going to part 1, change. Part 2, part 1. True. Great. And now, what about some rotation? So if we have position, let's do rotation. Give us a little spin on y-axis. And give us a little scale. Scale is going to be 1, and give it a little taller, I think 5 and 1. So when we do this, we got to parse this. On both of these, this is redundant, so we're going to have to pull attributes out of this. So this is create or update the entity, and I think we should return the entity. So return the mesh, and we'll move this business out. These two should be the same, I think. So take that out, take this out. So if you find the mesh, so this is if you don't find the mesh. If no mesh, do that. So you're just creating or updating the entity. So now we're just conditionally create or find entity. That's what it's doing. So create or find. So create or find mesh. Let mesh or find mesh. Okay. Where are we? So we've got that mesh. Then we say this update mesh. So update the mesh, given the mesh, give this the entity too. So mesh is some kind of abstract, Babylon abstract mesh, entity, it's an entity. Sorry, entity is an element. Paste this code back. Update mesh, the mesh and the entity. Here, if position, do that, and pretty much the same for scale and rotation. So let's just give it a list. So position, rotation, scale. For each of any of these matters, do this. If you can find that attribute header, then the mesh header gets you this header. So does that work? Go to part 2. Oh yes, go back to part 1. Aha. So because the rotation wasn't defined on the previous one, when we go back to state 1, it's left as is, which I guess is expected behavior. But is it supposed to get bigger? So if we go to part 2, did it get bigger? I don't think the scale actually got bigger. Maybe it did. It's so slight. Can we do something more pronounced? That one. The rotation definitely worked. Scale didn't work. Is that not how scale works? Let's get that mesh with desk 2. So scene get mesh by name desk 2. There's no desk 2? What is that called? Desk. Desk. Huh? Oh. It's not desk. It's a box. Desk. And then scale. Oh. It is scaled. Look at that. 1, 1. But why doesn't it look bigger? Scale.y is 5. X, 1, X, Y. How about scale X equal 5? Hmm. So open up the scene, debug, layer.show. These nodes, we got the lock desk. And tell me more. Scaling. Okay, here. Oh, scaling. Scaling. Position, rotation, scale. Why is it called scaling? So if I did that, does it work? Go to part 2. This still doesn't work. Scaling. Oh. Scaling. Scaling. There you go. Scaling. Position, rotation, scaling. Alright, fine. That's what you want to call it. And we come back down to part 1. And go to part 2. Part 1. Okay. It doesn't get bigger. But it coming back, it doesn't go smaller. So I think this is a good place to stop.